I'm going to start by just giving you a wee bit of background about this installation. Originally, the plan was to have this room as a Dolby Atmos cinema room. With Dolby Atmos, you can have a maximum rather, of 64 speakers. And we were looking at a Dolby Cinema license here. We have, I think, 44 speakers, Martin?
There's 32 surround speakers.
Okay.
3 screen loudspeakers.
Okay, that's 5.
One large subwoofer behind the screen. 2 subwoofers either side of the room. And we have the near field speakers on the stands and some domestic speakers on the desk.
So originally we were looking at an actual Dolby RMU, which is a machine made by Dolby, designed specifically for doing the rendering process, and that machine is capable of rendering those amount of speakers up to 64. During the course of events, the things changed slightly due to the build. We couldn't really have the build adhering to the strict Dolby specifications for cinema license, and it was, I don't like using the word downgraded, let's say it was changed to a more theatrical license. Now, what that meant was we're using a different way of rendering, which is actually how you have it upstairs in the music department. We have a separate computer still doing the rendering, and that separate computer is a Mac Mini. Now, that Mac Mini has installed on it the Dolby rendering software, as well as a few other bits and pieces. And you may ask yourself, where is the monitor for the Mac Mini? Because I can't even see it in this room. In fact, it's sitting behind that big screen. What you have on there, on the main Pro Tools workstation, is a remote version of the Dolby renderer. So we can view the renderer application on the Mac Mini from the Pro Tools workstation through the help of a network. As simple as that. So we can see exactly what's going on when we're trying to render and set that all up through the remote renderer application.
Is that the application there?
The application
that's hiding behind the back of that,
there.
Yeah.
So that is what we're looking at just now. I know you can't really see this, Alex, but what we're looking at right now is a representation of the Dolby renderer app, which is what we have on the Mac Mini. Now, what we have in the room, I'm going to start way from the beginning. I'm going to introduce you to all the kit here from the very start.
Eric, can I just ask you,
Yeah.
is that renderer sometimes a hardware box, like a Dolby hardware box?
Yes,
or
it is.
Always...
It is, and you know, Dolby are no longer providing installations like that anymore.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a Dolby Atmos box, and
to be honest, that box as well was just a computer that was just
approved
by
exactly,
Yeah.
With the name Dolby on it and costing a hell of a lot of money.
16,000.
Yeah, something like that. But they didn't actually sell it; they rented it out.
Yeah.
But none of that is relevant anymore because our renderer now is the Mac Mini, and it doesn't really require much horsepower to do what it needs to do.
Okay.
But we're going to return to the Mac Mini very shortly anyway, just to kind of recap and talk about the audio workflow we have here. But just starting from the very, very beginning of what we have in the room. We have, to the left of the console, a rack. At the bottom of the rack, there is a little converter there. It's a video converter. It's an SDI to HDMI. And this requires a bit of explanation because we have, in effect, 3 workstations in this room. One is the main Pro Tools workstation, which is a big Mac Pro sitting here. We have an iMac Pro sitting here. The purpose of this is really for video playback via Media Composer. Installed on this iMac Pro really is just that, Media Composer. And you may ask yourself, can't we not play back video from the Pro Tools workstation? And the answer is yes, of course. However, there are two reasons why people use the video on a separate workstation. One is to lessen the load on the Pro Tools workstation, and secondly, if you are in an environment where you have Media Composer, edits change all the time, and it's quite easy just to provide a Media Composer file and suddenly all your video is there for you rather than doing a lot of reconforming. It's shown that process. A lot of facilities now tend not to use it, and that's simply because Macs have become really, really powerful now, and you don't need to offload the video, the resources like that. So, but we have it here. Now, because the video is playing back from this workstation, we have attached to it an AJA video card. Now, this connects to the computer via Thunderbolt, and that is how you get video in and out of this workstation. We have an SDI cable from the AJA card, actually it's a box rather than a card, going to that little converter box at the very bottom of that rack, and out of that little converter box we have an HDMI cable running all the way through a cable sock to this projector here, which is pointing at the screen. So that's how we get in video. The video is going to emerge from this workstation. I think what we're looking at, and this is with your help, Hamish, is we're looking at a video switcher to give you the best of both worlds. So you can utilize the video satellite should you wish, or use a more conventional way of having video where you can just switch video playback from the Pro Tools workstation.
Okay.
In order to do that, there's no video card with the Pro Tools workstation. We'll be using the video as in the form of an extended desktop. It's almost as if you have a second monitor attached, and you'll be shoving the video window onto that second monitor, which in this case will be the big screen over there.
Actually, how does the transport work between Media Composer and Pro Tools? Have you got, is it MIDI machine code or something?
No. Basically built into both Media Composer and Pro Tools, because they're made by the same people that can do this, is a technology they call video satellite.
Oh, okay. I
It's
think
a
I've seen it in the
feature.
preferences.
And we are going to be covering this later.
Okay, don't worry about it.
But it happens over the network.
Yeah.
And it's a bi-directional transport. I hit play and stop or whatever in Media Composer, and it affects Pro Tools and vice versa. But
And it's solid. I'm going to.
it is really solid.
Okay, that's
It really is. But we'll be covering that a little later on. There's not much. The good news is there's not much to do to set this up in both the Pro Tools software as well as the Media Composer, but you do need to know how to do it.
That's the sort of thing a
Yes.
technician gets asked.
So that's the first little thing in the rack, which led to that whole kind of story with Media Composer. The next item we have here, it's made by a company called Rosan Dahl, and it's called the Nano Syncs HD. To be frank, it's a little overkill, but it is the master clock. We're obviously talking about digital technology here, and what makes audio sound really, really good is the synchronization between the samples, as we know. And this device offers far better jitter clock specification than Avid's own synchronization unit. So it's merely a clock source, but there's something that you must really know about it, and that is when you have devices and one clock is out of sync with another clock, you won't hear anything. and this is something that you come across, and it's a real head scratcher. why can't I hear anything? How come there's no sound? This is one that you have to remember for your troubleshooting. The nano sync is your master clock. You really want to keep that at excuse me, 48 kilohertz for a few reasons. One is Dolby Atmos only works at 48 anyway, so if you switch that to 44, you're not going to do any Dolby Atmos. But if that's at 48, everything else has to follow suit. Pro Tools has to be at 48. If you load up a Pro Tools sessions and it's at 44, there's a problem. You have to do one of two things. Either convert your Pro Tools session to 48 or change the clock on the NanoSync to 44. One or the other. Otherwise, without that parity, you won't hear a thing.
But you don't, ideally you want to be 48 because you want to work in Atmos.
Correct.
If a student has made a
just
project in
really
44.1, for
Yeah.
example, accidentally,
Yeah.
and they walk into this room, load their project up,
Yeah. What would happen?
what would happen? Would
Oh,
the nanosync change it?
No,
Okay.
it doesn't change automatically.
Okay.
You have to actually physically change it on the NanoSync, which we'll cover as well. But, you know, converting Pro Tools sessions is a piece of cake as well. When you import data that's at a different sample rate, it will say, do you want to convert? So it's easy.
I'm teaching the film soundies that the standard session setup is 48/24.
Oh, that's great.
So all of our students should know that, but I suppose it's just when, you know, if they're bringing sessions in from music pods.
Well, absolutely, and it's so crucial. I'm kind of signposting this somewhat, simply because this you've got nanosyncs in other rooms here, and it's a common thing that you'll come to where you don't hear any sound, and it's due to a lack of parity between the nanosync and your session. So, one to remember. Okay, now, because that's the master, you've got a word clock out of that nanosync, and that's going to the other clocking device, which is called the Sync HD, which is the device above that. Traditionally, a lot of studios would simply have the Sync HD as its master clock. So that's when I said it's overkill. But so this is almost like a go-between. NanoSync word clock out to word clock in of Pro Tools. It's important that you know that word clock is your master clock source because you set that up in the session setup of Pro Tools as well. Yeah. Any questions on that?
So is the nanosync slaved to the
Yeah.
nanosync?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can only have one master,
Yeah.
says my wife. And I'm not making that up either.
I know what you feel.
Sorry, Alex, you were going to say something. I interrupted.
I was going to say it's easy enough to set up a template session, isn't it?
Oh,
Or a session template that has the word clock as the clock in and stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think I mentioned this before we started this whole Zoom Teams thing, and that is one of the things that we're going to ensure happens over the course of the 2 days is that we have some templates made up. Those templates will be designed in accordance to how you want to teach. So we may have a 5.1, an Atmos, 7.1, 7.1.2 session, you know, that sort of thing. And you'll have all the tracks already there. It's all good to go, just the way you want. So we are going to be making templates like that.
The problem from
Yeah.
a technician's point of view is when people bring sessions they've already started elsewhere, and
Yeah.
that drags in crazy I/O stuff. And all kinds of
Yeah.
things like that.
But-
And that Pro Tools tends to like to hang on to its last.
Yeah, which is why what we're going to also be doing is saving
Yeah.
our I/O settings in a separate place as well, because that happens quite frequently. That's a very common thing, Sam.
Every
And
day.
what we'll do is that we're going to save the inputs, the outputs, and the buses as 3 separate files. And
Okay.
if it comes to it, with IOs, it's a complete pain in the neck for everyone. And someone will bring in another session, and what they could do is say restore from session, and suddenly it screws up the whole IO. You can't hear anything. So the response to that would be, let's load up the IO from our defaults, which we will create and put in our documents folder. And then
Okay.
it might be a case of mapping some of the tracks from the student session to the correct IO.
Because my intention is to try and teach them all this,
Yeah.
but it's incredibly complex, and I know
Oh,
that
it
there's
is.
going to be issues.
Oh,
So if there's ways that we can sort of simply implement that kind of, you know,
I would have made it kind of. I would have made it easy though, because, we'll cover this later. I must admit, in this training session, I like this because we'll go and I'll follow your lead. So we'll kind of go to wherever you want to go just now. But with the IO, it's one of the most convoluted windows in Pro Tools. But over the years, what they've done is that they've tried to simplify it by actually giving you some templates to open up. So you can say, use a Dolby Atmos setup, use a 7.1, use a 5.1. Just to finish up with that I/O thing, the most complicated I/O setups that you'll come across is within when you're using Dolby Atmos with the renderer, as you probably know. But the key to it is if the renderer is fine, it's a piece of cake. And that's because within the I/O setup, there's this really good thing where you can select the renderer as your I/O source, and it just maps it straight into your I/O from the renderer. Nothing else to do.
At least wish I'd known about that 2 years ago when I started doing
I'll
it.
show you how to do that. It's easy. If I could just return to some of the connectivity with the clocking source.
It's been interesting.
So we were talking about the connectivity from the master clock, which is the NanoSync. I'll just point to it on the screen here. Can you see that? The NanoSync. And you can see that as the master clock has to send information to a variety of places. In fact, anything that requires synchronization, video sync to allow for frame, edge, video accuracy, this is responsible for. So we have our cable coming out of the NanoSync, going to the Sync HD. Word clock out, word clock in. Also, I think there are probably about 3 or 4 word clock outs.
Yeah, I think there's half a dozen.
Yeah, we've got another one going to what's called the matrix. I'm going to come to that in just 1 minute. And finally, we've got one going to the AJA card, I believe. Where is that? Down here. That's the AJA card. So everything's perfectly in sync, and the NanoSync's responsible for that. So imagine you turn that off. You scuppered.
Yeah.
So let's keep it on. Rule number 1: why is it all out of sync? Is that on? Check the sample rate. So troubleshooting. I'm aware that I've been somewhat remiss at not introducing this chap behind me, Roman. Roman, could you say hello to Alex there, please?
Hi, Alex.
Roman
Hey,
works
man.
for MediaSpec, and it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that he is way cleverer than I could ever be. But he's also the one who's been responsible behind the scenes of calibrating the room, of putting together the whole Dante network and making sure all these speakers are working, and really organising the whole workflow, the audio workflow, but we're going to come to that. Throughout the course of today and tomorrow, he'll probably step in to explain some of the software configurations as well. Okay, moving on. So that's the sync. Talking of the sync, it has to connect to a Pro Tools system. I know you've got Sync HDs elsewhere in your building, and if you recall, the way it connects to Pro Tools is through an 8-pin DIN cable, which has been out for 20 years. Those of you who kind of remember Macs of old, that's how old printers and modems used to be connected, so it's a really crappy cable, and it can tend to fall out, but I suppose because it's in that rack, it should just be steady. But if you lose sync HD from your Pro Tools settings, usually this means one of two things have happened. The cable has come out from one of the ends, or alternatively, it's not on. Okay, now that connects to the first HDX card. Now, an HDX card, are you all familiar with yet? I can explain very briefly. There you go. An HDX card is the main audio card which is Avid's flagship audio card, and it's installed as a PCIe card in this big fancy Mac Pro. You've in fact got 3 of them. Again, a little overkill. You could have done with 2. But don't. I know this has been recorded and I shouldn't have said that. But
I'll edit it out.
yeah, okay.
You'll need it eventually.
You could actually repurpose that for another room incidentally, if you ever had to in the future. Take that HDX card and put it in the other room. Because the other room connects via Thunderbolt, and it uses a Focusrite interface which has Digilink on it. So that's the future. So that's the Sync HD. We can see it in the drawing here. And there is what's called a Digi-serial cable going all the way back to a card which is inside the Mac Pro. And that is it. Now, it also provides LTC as well for timecode reference, which is why we have an LTC out of the sync unit into, believe it or not, what's called Avio. This brings us on to a discussion, but we're not going to get in depth just yet, but it is about Dante. And as you know, there's a Mac Pro with Pro Tools and there's a Mac Mini with the renderer, and they both have to be synchronized together. And the way they are in sync is using LTC. But we are going to be covering that a little later on, so I won't expand too far just yet. But all will be revealed about that connection at LTC, which is crucial. What we have above the Sync HD is probably one of the most crucial boxes. It is the I/O interface. In the old days, people would call it a BOB, breakout box or whatever, but that is the audio interface that we use for Pro Tools. Now, basically, when you buy that box, it's like an empty shell. It's called the Matrix, MTRX. I know with your older Pro Tools systems, you may have had HDIOs and 192s and 888s, etc. This is the flagship replacement for that, and it is a beast. It's a bit of a paradox here. I mean, its best things is that it's incredibly flexible. The negative is that it's incredibly flexible as well, which we'll come to because the software is so convoluted. But we are going to be covering that in detail. But inside this Matrix, when you buy this Matrix box, it's hardly got any inputs and outputs. It's got card slots where you can add AD cards, DA cards. But as standard, it has Digilink ports on it. So that is how we connect it to our Pro Tools systems. It comes as standard with one Digilink card as standard. That means you can connect that one card to one HDX card. On an HDX card, there are 2 ports on it. They're called Digilink ports. Each port is capable of 32 channels of inputs and outputs. Therefore, a single card is capable of 64 channels of inputs and outputs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you can divide it between ins and outs, where you've got 64 of them.
Correct. We've got 3 cards, which is a total of 192 inputs and outputs. So there are 6 cables, Digilink cables, because remember, one cable is 32 channels, 6 cables going between the Matrix and the 3 cards that we have in the Mac Pro.
Okay.
Now, as well as Digilink ports on this matrix, what we've done is that we've put 2 Dante cards in there as well. One Dante card provides 128 channels of I/O. But before we talk about that, we have to just explain what the hell is Dante. In the old days, audio, you used to use cables, analog cables, for transferring audio from A to B. And now, over Cat 5, minimum of Cat 5, you can transfer hundreds of channels of audio back and forth without any sound degeneration, without any crosstalk, without any issues at all, from A to B down one Cat 5 cable. We call this technology audio over IP Internet Protocol, but the company that has really spearheaded this throughout the whole world of audio is a company called Audinate. Audinate probably account for about 80% of the audio over IP products that are floating around the world. Audinate make a product called Dante. So try not to kind of confuse this Hoover vacuum cleaner thing. It's
Yeah.
Dante is not audio over IP. It's a byproduct of that, but it's still using the processes of sending audio over network cables, and that is how we send audio from our Mac Pro to our renderer, which is on a Mac Mini hidden behind that screen. We use Dante. So down one cable, we can transfer 128 channels of audio from A to B, A being our Pro Tools system, B being the renderer, on the Mac Mini behind the screen. So that's why we have one Dante card in there. That's its purpose, to transfer audio back and forth between the Pro Tools rig and the renderer, the Dolby renderer. We have a second Dante card, and it has a different purpose altogether. It's for the speakers. Because what we want to do is, we've got hundreds of speakers here. Well, 43, 44. And I suppose you could have said, wait a minute, why don't we just shove DA cards in the matrix and then connect that to the speakers? And you could have done it that way, except it would have been horrendously expensive, because, you know, one DA card is 8 channels. You've got 40 odd speakers. You know, a DA card is like $3,500, and then, you know, do the math of it. It's a hell of a lot of money. So a cheaper way of doing it would be using Dante. So what we've done is that we put a 64 channel Dante card inside the matrix, and sent those channels directly to 2 boxes made by Tascam, each of
Good
which,
old Tascam.
yep, they're converters. These are analog Dante and Dante analog converters, and they're not that expensive. So
What model are they?
they call the ML-32. Yeah, Google is your friend. Yes.
That's on the second drawing of the.
Yeah.
And do they sit kind of behind the screen?
You got it. Yeah, that's why you don't see any of that. They're sitting behind the screen.
On the top.
But, you know, we've got a wee... Martin yesterday came up and did a nice little video, so we'll actually, rather than crawl under the under the screen, we'll show you a video shortly of the actual units. But they're 1U in size each. You don't get a 64 channel version, which is why we've got 2 32s. So we turn into the matrix. We've got a Dante card in there, which is capable of 64 channels, and that is going over one Cat 5 or 6 cable to believe it or not, one of the ML32s, and then the ML32 is daisy chained to the second ML32, thus sending a total of 64 channels of audio. Now, on those ML32 Tascam jobs, it's got analog outputs, it's got D-subs on it, and that's what we use to connect to the power amps which drive the speakers. Much cheaper way of doing it that way. Saves you 25 grand. So that's the flow of traffic. So that's what we have inside the matrix. It's got Digilink, it's got 2 Dante cards, and that's it. The way this was spec'd, just to be very clear, it was spec'd without any analog inputs. It was something that was drawn to Arup's attention, but this was always the intention that this was not a requirement to record analog audio into this system, because everything's going to be file based, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, so just in case you say, how do I record a voiceover, how do I do this? Well, you don't have, you'll need another thing to do that. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so that's the matrix. It is depicted in the drawing here. You can see this, you see Digilink 1 to 6, and those are going to the HDX cards. We've got Dante cards, one of which will be going ultimately to a main network, which will go to the speakers, well, the Tascams and then the speakers, and then the other Dante card is going to the Tascams. That's in another drawing, I believe, right?
Yes.
Martin, so we don't
Shall I pull the other drawing?
yeah, would you mind?
This
Thank
Dante
you.
stuff.
Yeah. It's awesome.
I know.
Yeah.
I've tested it. It's faster than a lot of sound cards that
Yeah,
I've attached
it's
to the computer.
great.
Can we send this Dante stream wherever we like in the building, or is that not how our network switches connect?
Well, to answer your question, yes.
We can.
You
out
can
of the box without
out
having
of the
to
box.
ring up ITS.
Yeah. Well, oh wait, no. Wait. So you had that.
Nowy people.
You had a little caveat there.
Yeah.
Here's the thing with Dante. I've been talking about Dante hardware inside that matrix,
Yeah.
but Audinate do this really good thing called the Dante Virtual Sound Card. So
Yeah.
virtual implying it's kind of software based.
So
And-
we actually have a concert using this stuff
Ah.
going on as we speak,
Oh,
or at least setting up.
fantastic.
Yeah.
And that's like $35 or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, which means that you can install that onto any computer, and if that's on the same kind of Dante network as this, then you can have audio going back and forth.
And conceivably, to go back to the point about voiceovers, is we could open up a Dante link to a completely other room and do voiceover in a
Sam,
recording studio.
listen, absolutely right. You when you open up a system with Dante, the audio routing possibilities are quite endless. It can be a real head scratcher because controlling all of this is controller software, which is called
Yeah.
the Dante controller, which we're going to come to as well, which Roman is going to take you through, which is like a matrix where you kind of routing ins and outs and outs and ins and things like that. But it means that you can route anything to anywhere as long as it's been
Yeah.
Dantified. Now, you might think, wait a minute, I've got this analog device. How can I put any analog onto a Dante network? And you can, because Audinate make these really amazing adapters. They're called Avio adapters. And that means you can attach any analog equipment to at one end, and at the other end is a Dante port, which means that anything can be put onto the Dante network.
We have
Now-
some little headphone boxes that do that.
Exactly. Now, I bring this up simply because I'm going to go back to this thing about LTC. Connected to the Sync HD is an analog port called LTC out. And we wanted to send that LTC in, bring that into the Dante network. And we have done that by using one of the Avio adapters. Did you get that, Alex?
Yes.
So LTC stems from the Sync HD, and it's an analog output. But we have brought it into the Dante domain by using one of Ordinate's adapters. So at one end, it's like an XLR, which you shoved into the back of the sync, and at the other end, it's a network port. We'll show you how we've configured that a little later on, but it's another example of how any analog equipment can be brought into the Dante domain. And you know, Sam, you've given an excellent example of how using Dante allows such endless routing. You know, you're using it right now, and even though we don't have any analog inputs, anywhere in this building which does have analog inputs, and you've installed, say, the Dante virtual sound card, we can bring that into here, into this room.
There was a caveat with that.
What's the
If
caveat?
you're on a network, if you're sharing any other data on the network, so it's not a ring fence just to Dante, you need to kind of take care of the bandwidth. Because
So,
at 44, take for example sample rate 44, on a 1 gigabit connection you can have 512 Dante channels going. If there's anything else going through that network, so you need to prioritize Dante, which will be just audio over IP in your switch. So have dedicated bandwidth just for that to make sure it always goes through.
That's a very important point, and what you notice is that the better switches have a feature on them called QoS, which stands for quality of service. This is a very important thing to know about Dante, because the bandwidth can be compromised as well when you just kind of, it's all hickety-pickety and you haven't configured it accordingly. Okay, we've got two more little things in this rack which are pretty brief to describe and pretty self-explanatory. The one above the matrix is simply a headphone amplifier. It's an 8-channel job, and I guess it's like in the room headphone amplifier, so you just shove headphones straight into there. You can route directly to the headphone amplifier from within Pro Tools. That's all kind of configured for you, but it just usually with headphone amplifiers they may be in voiceover rooms, etc. But I guess what you, for teaching purposes, you're showing the workflow. You're showing the workflow how to send audio to a headphone amplifier, albeit that it's in the same room. It's good to.
Yeah.
Is that on their own analog outs from Pro Tools, or is they just cloned off 1 or 2? Or
How's the routing for the headphone amp, Roman?
sorry,
I think I think it's just analog outputs. We've just designated.
It's analog off the Tascam.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically,
64 to Tascam.
have they got their own dedicated channels on the
yes.
I/O page? Oh right, that's
Yes,
all right.
they are, and you know what? We've called it headphone amp. So this is all going to be.
What? How do you survive in this industry?
Yes.
You've got to give it a 19 left to
Yeah, I know. This is not Windows. So that's what we've done. You know, we've got these speakers here. They're called near fields.
Yeah.
So, and we call these domestics. These are the little ones here, and that's what they'll be called in the I/O setup.
Right.
Oh, perfect.
So that
That's really
you're not going to get lost.
Sam, you can rename them strange things.
I'll
that'll
do that. Yeah.
confuse people.
I
I'll also move that power switch closer to people's knees. Because that's the other thing.
Put in a
That's
couple of
done in
exclamation
wrong
marks, hyphens,
Yeah.
lots of numbers. You still with us, Alex?
yeah.
Okay, so that's the headphone amp. So even though it's not used in the traditional sense, you're at least demonstrating to the students the workflow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And finally, above it, there is
The power distribution. So each particular item has got a label on the strip here which tells you which piece of equipment it's feeding. If you see any of these LEDs go red, it means the fuse has blown.
Nice.
So the first thing to do is to try and find out why the fuse has blown. Or you can just stick another fuse in and watch it blow again.
I love
I've actually seen it where people have substituted fuses and they've ended up with only one working at the end of it. But really, if a piece of equipment blows more than one fuse, then there's something wrong with it, and you need to get that investigated.